This autumn, that is 2024 for those who might be watching in future years, stories have resurfaced all over the media about how the Jack the Ripper case has been solved using DNA evidence. The purpose of this film is quite simple. It's to investigate the evidence to see if there's any truth behind these claims. I will also tell the story of how this whole business impacted the world of Ripperology. I will start by saying the history of the item from which samples were taken, which were later tested for DNA. The item concerned is most commonly described as a shawl. This has been doubted. It may in fact have been a table runner, a length of material that is laid out on a long table for decorative effect. Whether it was intended as a shawl or as a table runner and used as a shawl is of little importance. For convenience, I will describe it as a shawl. It was made of silk with tassels at one end and had a floral design dyed on most of one of the surfaces. The shawl is damaged and has been cut into two parts. There is heavy staining on it and smaller chunks have been cut out altogether. This is the supposed chain of ownership. Allegedly, the shawl was acquired by Acting Serjeant Amos Simpson, who obtained it in the course of his duties with the Metropolitan Police in 1888. Before he died in 1917, he gave it to his sister Mary Simpson, later Smith, who died around 1926. It then passed to her daughter Eliza Smith, later Mills, who died in 1966, and then to her daughter Eliza Mills, later Hayes, who died in 1997. She gave it to her son David Melville Hayes in 1986. In 1988, coincidentally, the 100th anniversary of the Jack the Ripper murders, a factor which itself invites suspicion, a Jack the Ripper researcher called Paul Harrison heard about a shawl that might be related to the case. In 1989, Harrison followed this up. He found that the shawl had been lent to an antiques dealer in Clacton-on-Sea in Essex, but had since been returned to David Melville Hayes, who also worked in the antiques business, specialising in hand-coloured prints. Another factor that invites suspicion. The Clacton antiques dealer had been allowed to keep two small pieces that were cut from the shawl and which were mounted in a frame. An antiques dealer cutting up a shawl which is supposedly an original Jack the Ripper artefact is yet another odd aspect of this story. According to David Melville Hayes, his great-great-uncle, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, had been on special duties relating to Fenian terrorism near Mitre Square, where the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered. He accompanied the body to the mortuary and was allowed to take the shawl, which was covered in blood, as some sort of souvenir by a more senior officer. He thought his wife might want to use it for dressmaking, but she didn't. Nevertheless, Amos Simpson kept it, and it was supposedly passed on through various branches of his family along with this story. In 1991, David Melville Hayes approached the Scotland Yard Crime Museum, popularly known as the Black Museum, and lent them the shawl. Meanwhile, two Ripperologists, Andy and Sue Parler, who lived in Clacton, heard about the shawl and managed to track down and buy the two small frame pieces that I referred to earlier. Soon afterwards, by chance, they bumped into David Melville Hayes at an antiques fair and learnt that the bulk of the shawl was at the Black Museum. In 1997, the Parlers were given special access to the Black Museum, which isn't open to normal members of the public, and found that the shawl was not on display, but was kept out of sight as its provenance was unclear. At that, David Melville Hayes wanted it back, and the Parlers had the task of retrieving it, although amazingly, the Black Museum cut out another small segment for their own keeping. It's quite amazing how unprofessional all these people were. As the Parlers had shown such an interest, David Melville Hayes allowed them to keep it on an extended loan, and they showed it at various events. For example, it made an appearance at Jack the Ripper conference held in Bournemouth in 2001. Reportedly, virtually every single attendee handled the shawl, obviously contaminating it with their own DNA. In 2006, the Shawl briefly featured in a TV documentary, and swabs were taken from some possible bloodstains to test for DNA, but the outcome was inconclusive. After this, David Melville Hayes decided to sell the Shawl, and a man called Russell Edwards bought it for an undisclosed sum following an auction in 2007. Russell Edwards later said that he had a predetermined belief that it was genuine. Prior to buying it, Russell Edwards contacted the Black Museum and spoke to the then curator Alan McCormack. McCormack told him that without a DNA test it couldn't be proven to be linked to the murder of Catherine Eddowes, and then went on to claim that the police had definitely solved the case and that the culprit was Aaron Kosminski, and that he had proof at the Black Museum to that effect. Alan McCormack has since passed away, but needless to say, it's total fiction to claim that the Black Museum holds any information proving that Kosminski was responsible for the Jack the Ripper murders. I won't go into the case against Kosminski here. If you want to learn more, then I'll provide a link in the description below to my film on Kosminski, in which I discuss all aspects of that theory. The one useful piece of information supplied by McCormack relating to the Shawl's provenance was that the prestigious Sotheby's auction house had examined it and determined that it was very early 20th century, but could be older. So the Shawl could possibly be old enough to have been at Mitre Square in 1888. In 2011, an Australian TV company made contact with Russell asking to test the Shawl for DNA to see if a link could be made to another suspect, Frederick Deeming. This was agreed and testing took place at Liverpool John Moores University. The test was again inconclusive. However, during the process, Russell met a scientist called Jari Louhelainen, a senior lecturer at the university who specialised in forensic genetics. Jari, as I'll henceforth call him for short to avoid mangling his surname, agreed to conduct more detailed scientific research into the stains on the Shawl. Examining the Shawl under ultraviolet light, Jari detected various other stains which were not visible to the naked eye, some of which he thought were blood and others possibly semen. Jari used the Shawl to test a new process to extract DNA from old contaminated objects. Over the years, countless people had handled it, leaving skin cells and other material over the surface. Simply taking a swab and testing it would likely result in some random person's DNA being analysed. Jari used a method that endeavoured to get inside the bloodstain and take a sample from within it. He also examined the other stain but couldn't determine whether or not it was semen. Mitochondrial DNA, or mDNA, which only passes via the female line, is more resilient and less prone to becoming degraded than genomic DNA or gDNA. But mDNA is less specific than gDNA. As the DNA from the Shawl was in very poor condition, only mDNA samples could be used, and these had to be amplified to enable testing. Russell then tried to trace relatives of Catherine Eddowes in order to have something to match any mDNA from the Shawl against. Luckily for him, Catherine Eddowes' great-great-great-granddaughter, Karen Miller, appeared on a TV show, and he successfully made contact with her and she agreed to provide some DNA samples. The next stage was to find a living relative of Kosminski through the female line, and again luck was on his side and he found one who was willing to provide a DNA sample. By the summer of 2014, Russell was ready to publish his findings, and he opened up a Jack the Ripper themed pop-up shop selling merchandise and books on Toynbee Street, which is right in the heart of Jack the Ripper territory. It was opposite the Duke of Wellington pub, which was frequented by Jack McCarthy, the landlord of the last supposed victim, Mary Kelly, and was just a stone's throw from both the location of Miller's Court, where Mary Kelly was murdered, and the most famous Jack the Ripper related pub, the 10 Bells. A better location for a Jack the Ripper themed pop-up shop could scarcely be imagined. The purpose behind this shop was to help promote a book that Russell Edwards was shortly to publish offering a definitive solution to the Jack the Ripper case, using the Shawl as evidence to prove that Aaron Kosminski was responsible for the murders. Russell Edwards' presence in the area caused great consternation in some quarters within the Ripperological community. This wasn't because it was thought that selling Jack the Ripper merchandise was vulgar, macabre, or in bad taste, but rather some tour guides thought that Russell Edwards would be bad for business. They believed that a key aspect of the pull that drew tourists in their thousands to go on Jack the Ripper tours was the mystique of the killer's identity being unknown. The popular perception was that if the case was solved, then that would put a big dent in the tour business. The other notable group that was particularly hostile towards Russell Edwards, ironically, consisted of those who favoured Kosminski as their number one suspect. They believed that Russell's claims would devalue and discredit their theory. So early on, battle lines were drawn, with the White Hart on Whitechapel High Street buzzing with anti-Russell Edwards sentiment and plots and schemes to bring him to his knees. Such is the nature of Ripperology. When the book, naming Jack the Ripper, was published in September 2014, it caused a worldwide sensation with huge publicity. It turned out that Russell Edwards had been given a lot of assistance by a prominent Ripperologist who was also a tour guide and who frequented the White Hart. But strangely, his name was never mentioned. I personally got on very well with Russell and often visited his shop for a chat, even though I obviously didn't share his enthusiasm for Kosminski as the prime suspect, and I often heard Russell on the phone to this guy who I knew. The key claim in Russell Edwards' book is that one of the mDNA samples from the blood matched that of Karen Miller, and that it was only shared by 1 in 290,000 of the world's population, or only 223 people living in all of Britain at the time the test was done. This is because there was a rare global private mutation known as 314.1C in common between the sample provided by Karen Miller and the sample from the Shawl. This obviously narrowed down things considerably. A single cell from the stain that may or may not have been semen was used for comparison, but because it was in poor condition, the DNA had to be amplified multiple times. The sample from the relative of Kosminski was said to be an exact match for a Russian in the group TIAI, which is less precise. Jari was on record as stating that given the provenance of the Shawl, which he regarded as impeccable, having been taken by Amos Simpson from the crime scene, allied to the mDNA sample, which was a rare match with that of Catherine Eddowes, together with the other sample, which was a good match for Kosminski, all this together effectively proved Russell Edwards' contention that he had solved the Jack the Ripper case. The publicity and acclaim that attached to Russell Edwards was in inverse proportion to the anger generated towards him within much of the Ripperological community. My personal take is that everyone is entitled to their opinion and their own suspects, as it all adds to the general popularity of the genre. Even cranky, idiotic or dishonest theorising is par for the course and has its place in Ripperology. An indivisible component within the Jack the Ripper phenomenon, the mythos, is that it has always bordered on the hurdy-gurdy, showground, Barnum and Bailey world of fantasy. It is a circus and always will be. This has literally been the case since 1888, with the letters that coined the name Jack the Ripper to the lurid newspaper headlines, the sketches in the illustrated weeklies. There was even a waxworks display of the victims set up on Whitechapel Road. Fighting against this is as futile as commanding the tides to recede in the manner of King Canute, allegedly. I'm no more hostile to Stephen Knight's Final Solution than I am to Hayley Rubenholz's 5 or Russell Edwards' Shawl, or to the 1980s Michael Caine TV miniseries or Johnny Depp's film From Hell. I have my own opinions and my own way of presenting the case, which I would claim is based on a serious, realistic criminological investigation, but I'm not blind to the overall situation in what is known as Ripperology. Most people are introduced to and drawn to this field via the less intellectually reputable sources. They grow interest in the field, and from that expanded population, the more discerning and curious will find my humble YouTube channel to find true enlightenment. And I enjoy researching other cases and discussing them or critiquing them as much as I enjoy promoting and debating my own theory, which I obviously do on this channel. In September 2014, I happened to be involved in assisting the owners of Happy Days Fish and Chip Shop and Restaurant in revamping their establishment. Happy Days occupies the exact location where Jack the Ripper left a portion of Catherine Eddowes' bloody apron after her murder at Mitre Square on the 30th September 1888. On the doorway above the apron, some graffiti was discovered that famously read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The doorway is still there, leading into the chip shop, although admittedly you need some imagination to picture the scene from back then, as needless to say it wasn't a chip shop in 1888. Every Jack the Ripper tour pauses outside the chip shop, as it's one of the very few authentic sites left from 1888. But the chip shop doesn't profit from any of this, as the tourists seldom enter, and indeed I've witnessed inconsiderate tour group leaders blocking the entrance while they tell their audience all about what happened there. I suggested to the owner of Happy Days that he tastefully themed the interior of his restaurant around the events of the Whitechapel murders, and he agreed that it would be good for business. I helped him with his design, and with the assistance of a few others supplied images for him to use, and that's why I was in the area frequently when Russell Edwards opened his shop and how I got to know him. When the publicity around Russell Edwards' book broke over the balmy late summer evenings of 2014, I witnessed hordes of tourists passing Happy Days on walking tours. It was like the crowds leaving Wembley Stadium after a cup final. Ka-ching! Rather than being put out of business, the tour owners' pockets were being lined by Russell Edwards. Anyway, the official relaunch of Happy Days took place on the anniversary of the double event, the 30th of September 2014. I asked Russell Edwards, who was the man of the moment, to cut the ribbon, to which he agreed. I explained to him that part of the purpose of the event was to get tour groups to buy into the revamped Happy Days so that their customers would be more inclined to stop for at least a bag of chips. So besides journalists and sundry ripperologists, all the local tour guides and tour group owners were invited to sample the fish and chip based canapes. Inevitably, Russell changed his mind about cutting the ribbon, although he did come along just before the event ended and after various other people had left. Meanwhile, Jari's claims of a DNA match were put under the microscope. Within the ripperological community, using the brief passages in Naming Jack the Ripper and a heavy dose of Google thumping, the same conclusions as those reached by the scientific community were drawn. On the 20th of October 2014, the Independent newspaper reported that Jari had made a serious error of nomenclature that completely undermined his case. Jari had referenced the blood and Karen Miller's sample against a DNA database to calculate the chances of a match. Remember, 314.1c was very rare and was shared by only 1 in 290,000 of the world's population. However, from the information Jari provided in the book, it became clear to 4 eminent DNA professors, Manis van Oven, Walter Parson, Hansi Weisensteiner and Alec Jeffreys, that the mutation was 315.1c, not 314.1c. This might not seem much, but 315.1c is shared by 99% of people of European descent. It's not in the least bit rare, but it is extraordinarily commonplace. At a stroke, the uniqueness of the connection to Catherine Eddowes was eliminated. The bloodstains could have come from virtually anyone. Strangely, Jari didn't submit his findings for peer review. For a new scientific finding to be accepted, this is standard practice. Otherwise, anyone could claim anything. Jari's findings and methodologies needed to have been published in a reputable scientific journal so that other scientists, his peers in the field, could determine whether they stacked up. Professor Alec Jeffreys, who invented DNA fingerprinting, said of Jari's work, "Needs to be subject to peer review with detailed analysis of the provenance of the shawl and the nature of the claimed DNA match with the perpetrator's descendants and its power of discrimination. No actual evidence has yet been provided." Coincidentally, soon after this, the excellent documentary, The Missing Evidence, Jack the Ripper, which was about the Lechmere theory, aired for the first time on Channel 5 in the UK. I had been assisting the production team with background information in relation to this documentary for some months and had often discussed it with Russell. This is the famous documentary featuring my good friend Krista Holmgren. I will also provide a link in the description below in case you haven't seen it before. In the preamble, the narrator said, "Recent DNA evidence from a shawl could be linked to 95% of the population." Clearly, I didn't write the script, nor have any say in how they told the story. I just provided the background research. But Russell Edwards clearly blamed me for those offending words, as he would barely speak to me again afterwards. It's having served its purpose, he shut his pop-up shop, but he did make one more well-known appearance. The Whitechapel Society is in effect the Jack the Ripper Society. It used to be called the Cloak and Dagger Club, but Whitechapel Society sounds more sanitised and respectable, and frankly it's less embarrassing if you want to hire a venue. In November 2014, the Whitechapel Society held a conference in Salisbury, and the headline speaker was to be Russell alongside Jari. I say speaker, but it wasn't as straightforward as that. The conference was the occasion for an incredible amount of acrimony before, during and after. Jari agreed to give a talk on his methodology, but Russell only agreed to attend with a bodyguard just to do a Q&A with Jari. The questions had to be submitted by attendees in advance before a certain date. What followed was a typical balls up. No pertinent or probing questions were submitted. So-and-so couldn't attend and thought someone else would submit a question on their behalf, but they forgot to, or they thought someone else would ask it. I was as guilty as anyone else. All Russell Edwards had to answer was a series of softball questions easily answered with platitudes. One attendee realised what had happened and tried to submit a more probing question just before the Q&A started, but this was refused by Russell Edwards as being outside the parameters under which he had agreed to attend, as was his right. Almost immediately, a false version of events circulated on the internet, on social media and various Jack the Ripper related forums, accusing the Whitechapel Society of being complicit in a cover-up and how it was a disgrace that they'd banned any probing questions. Posts were also made on TripAdvisor claiming that attendees had gone down with food poisoning at the conference venue. It was the biggest scandal to hit Ripperology for decades at least, but none of it was actually true. The Whitechapel Society had invited Russell to appear. Any interested Ripperologist could attend, and any attendee could have asked him or Jari a searching question about the error of nomenclature or 314.1c or whatever. But no searching questions were asked in the pre-advertised manner. It wasn't very fashionable to publicly defend Russell Edwards or the role the Whitechapel Society had played in this affair. In fact, the only person who did publicly defend the Whitechapel Society and debunk the false allegations made about what had happened at the conference was me, for which I was roundly attacked, mostly by people who weren't even at the conference and who couldn't grasp why I, as a very vocal advocate of the Lechmere theory, was defending, or rather accurately explaining, what had happened. Not that I got any thanks from Russell Edwards, who by this stage was no longer on speaking terms with me, nor the Whitechapel Society for that matter. I recount all this to give people an insight into the weird world of Ripperology, which, to be fair, is little different to many other specific interest groups where violent passions are raised over the most obtuse and, in the scheme of things, trivial topics. But let's return to Amos Simpson, because the provenance of the shawl is an essential component in supporting or undermining the science. Although I was on friendly terms with Russell Edwards when he published his book, and although I went out on a limb to defend what had happened at the Whitechapel Society Conference, I'd also researched the background of Amos Simpson in Hertfordshire Archives, the National Archives, the Metropolitan Police Museum, and I visited Cheshunt and even his home village in Suffolk. I think I'm the only person who did this. Amos Simpson was born in Acton in Suffolk in 1846 and joined the Metropolitan Police in 1868. In 1881, he was promoted to Acting Serjeant, which allowed him to wear 2 stripes or chevrons on his sleeve, and he transferred to Cheshunt. Russell Edwards inaccurately said in his book, Simpson transferred to N Division, Islington, where he was still based at the time of the Ripper murders. Later in his police career, he moved to Cheshunt in Hertfordshire and served with the Hertfordshire Constabulary. This isn't correct. Simpson, who was initially in Y Division, was posted to Cheshunt in 1881 when he was promoted to Acting Sergeant. In 1886, he transferred to N Division because the boundary between Y and N changed and Cheshunt was put in N Division when it was previously in Y. This was all reported in police orders, a daily record of Metropolitan Police movements. There's also a newspaper report from 1881 of Acting Sergeant Simpson being involved in a rather horrible case in Waltham Cross, which was part of Cheshunt, involving an infant death. The relevance of all this is that although Amos Simpson was in N Division at the time of the Ripper murders in 1888, and the southern boundary of N Division was quite close to the City of London and indeed Whitechapel, the police station to which Amos Simpson was attached was in Cheshunt in Hertfordshire, which was then a quiet rural area way to the north of London. N Division's boundary stretched out to the outer suburbs. The Metropolitan Police covered an area roughly 15 miles out from Charing Cross. Actually, the boundaries between the Hertfordshire Constabulary and the Metropolitan Police were not rationalised until the year 2000, after which the Metropolitan Police area matched the political boundary of Greater London. So until 2000, Cheshunt was in the Metropolitan Police area even though it was in Hertfordshire. In 1885, Amos Simpson had his 2 children baptised in Cheshunt. His address was given as Turner's Hill, which is the main road through Cheshunt. He actually lived just off Turner's Hill in the strangely named Jews' Corner, spelt G-E-W-S, not J-E-W-S or even J-U-W-E-S, where he was found in the 1891 census and his police pension records when he retired in 1893. His cottage in Jews' Corner, which rarely for a Ripper-related building, is still standing. It's just around the corner from the police station where he was based, and which is now roughly where a Tesco's supermarket stands today. In 1888, Simpson was mentioned in the local newspapers in connection with various local crimes. In one case, a local property owner planted trees down a certain road, and over succeeding days and weeks they were vandalised. The owner complained to the police and Amos Simpson was tasked with staking out the trees. One midnight he caught a local man red-handed tearing one of the remaining trees down and he duly arrested him. In another case, a man burnt down a barn, seemingly as a result of a property dispute. He claimed to be at home at the time, but was seen by a witness climbing over a hedge in a field next to the burning barn. When Amos Simpson arrested him, the man claimed, "I am as innocent as a child just born." They all say that, don't they? So, at the time of the Ripper murders, Simpson lived and was based in Cheshunt, working as a rural policeman, nowhere near Mitre Square or the City of London. There's much more fantastic content in this film, so watch to the end and please subscribe, share and like and comment below as always. Russell Edwards' case based on information supplied by Amos Simpson's great-great-great-nephew, David Melville Hayes, was that Amos Simpson acquired the shawl at or near Mitre Square, which was in the City of London. This highlights a basic jurisdictional problem. Simpson was in the Metropolitan Police, and the investigation into the murder of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square was conducted by the City of London Police, which was, and still is, a separate force from the Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police did not, unless under special circumstances, operate in the City of London. So what could a Metropolitan policeman be doing in or near Mitre Square? I mentioned earlier the vague suggestion that he was on special duties, and those duties were in connection with Fenian activity. However, when policemen were seconded out of their division to act on special duties, this would be mentioned in police orders. There's no mention of Amos Simpson being assigned to any special duties in this period, nor to any special duties relating to Fenian activity. Amos Simpson's original posting, his promoting to acting sergeant, his transfer between divisions are all mentioned in police orders, as is his retirement and his volunteering to help line the route at Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1887, for which he received a medal, and his volunteering, after he had retired, to line the route for Edward VII's coronation in 1903, which was cancelled as Edward VII had to have an operation for appendicitis. All of this is recorded, but not the special duties in the City of London in September 1888. And of course, none of the reports at the time mention any Metropolitan Police officer being present at Mitre Square in the whole episode surrounding Catherine Eddowes' murder. The suggestion that an acting sergeant, used to dealing with people who burn down barns or vandalise trees, would be seconded to special duties relating to Fenianism is slightly ludicrous. Furthermore, if Amos Simpson was at Mitre Square, how likely would it be for a city police inspector to allow a Metropolitan Police officer to take away a piece of evidence from a murder that had only moments before been committed? The clothing of all the victims was examined very closely to aid in establishing their identity. This was also the case with Catherine Eddowes. It beggars belief that a city inspector would allow a Metropolitan Police acting sergeant to take away an item. And again, no Metropolitan policeman was even mentioned as being present during this whole episode. Russell Edwards attempted to prove that the shawl was with the Simpson family as far back as 1892 by quoting an extremely obscure story that appeared in an American magazine called The Collector, a current record of art, biography and antiquarianism. In it, a reporter met a man in the Cheshire Cheese off Fleet Street and came across the story of a charwoman who owned a shawl owned by one of the victims that she wanted to dispose of. Russell Edwards speculated that the charwoman was Amos Simpson's wife and that she wanted to get rid of the shawl. Also, David Melville Hayes had told Russell Edwards that Amos Simpson's son may have worked in the Cheshire Cheese at the time. Unfortunately, the wife and son were living in Cheshunt at the time, many miles to the north of the good old Cheshire Cheese. The chances of them commuting to work in low-paid jobs around Fleet Street are almost zero. I'm struck that Russell Edwards' research didn't turn up the fact that they were living in Cheshunt at the time, yet he located an article in an obscure American magazine called The Collector, a current record of art, biography and antiquarianism. Or was he helpfully put onto that by David Melville Hayes, who was after all an antiques dealer who specialised in hand-coloured prints? When Amos Simpson retired in 1893, he moved back to Barrow Hill in Acton, Suffolk, and lived with his daughter, who later married into the local Stearns family, who heavily populate the local graveyard. This in itself makes it slightly strange that when Amos Simpson died in 1917, while living with his daughter and her children, his grandchildren, the shawl was passed to his sister and not to his daughter's family, who he lived with, or even his son and his family. His son also married into the Stearns family and moved up to Acton. Meanwhile, Amos Simpson's sister, Mary Simpson, had married a George Smith and was living in Lavenham, a few miles north of Acton. She was a laundress. Her house was the laundry. What would she want with a filthy shawl? It's also, of course, strange that his sister's family seem over-invested in Amos and remembered his activities as a policeman and even his son's alleged brief job as a young potman in the Cheshire Cheese. It's often assumed that the shawl belonged to Catherine Eddowes. In his book, Russell Edwards dwelt on this report concerning Catherine Eddowes' dress. Her dress was made of green chintz, the pattern consisting of Michaelmas daisies. Yet Russell Edwards believes that the shawl was owned by Kosminski and taken by him to the crime scene and left by the body. This is his reasoning, following on from that press report. This is a vital piece of information, and it is on this item of clothing that my whole investigation into the identity of Jack the Ripper rests. So why was it not on the police list of her belongings? While the body was being transported to the mortuary, Acting Serjeant Amos Simpson, who was accompanying it, asked another more senior officer if he could have this piece of clothing, which was in fact a shawl, not a skirt. He wanted it for his wife because silk was clearly of good quality, and he thought she might be able to use it for her dressmaking. We can only assume the press included this description of the chintz dress or skirt with the border of Michaelmas daisies in their reports because a journalist was either present at the scene and glimpsed the material, or that they talked to policemen who were there and who again mistook the distinctive pattern shawl for a skirt or dress. So a reporter had glimpsed the shawl somewhere and assumed it was Catherine Eddowes' dress. Why did Russell Edwards think that the shawl belonged to Kosminski? Firstly, Catherine Eddowes was poor and had pawned her valuable possessions and would surely have also pawned the shawl had she owned it. Secondly, the dyed colouring on the shawl was also water-soluble. Catherine Eddowes spent a lot of her time out on the streets and the colours would have run the first time that it rained. Thirdly, Russell Edwards obtained various opinions on its age and origin, and the general consensus was that it was probably continental, and he convinced himself that it was of Russian origin. Testing of the material and dyes also suggested that it could date to pre-1888. Russell Edwards believed that it was significant that the Christian feast of St Michael, Michaelmas, fell on the 29th of September in the Roman Catholic and Anglican faiths and on the 8th of November in the Eastern or Orthodox churches. These dates were immediately before the double event murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the 30th of September and that of Mary Kelly on the 9th of November. So now he had a motive for Kosminski leaving his supposedly Russian shawl at the crime scene, the shawl that he supposedly brought with him when his family fled Russian-occupied Poland to Britain in about 1881 or 1882. A shawl that was covered in what he thought were Michaelmas daisies and was left at Mitre Square on the day after the Western churches celebrated Michaelmas, which Kosminski would have been aware of even though he was a Polish Jew from territory where Michaelmas was celebrated on a different day. But then he was also mad. But what was the context of that press report that mentioned the Michaelmas daisies? It's important because Russell Edwards uses this report as a means to link the shawl to contemporary records. On the 4th of October, the Cornish Telegraph dispassionately listed: the following is the official description of the body and clothing. Aged about 40, length 5 foot, dark auburn hair, hazel eyes. Dress: black jacket with imitation fur collar, 3 large metal buttons, brown bodice, dark green chintz with Michaelmas daisy and Gordon lily pattern, 3 flounces. Thin white vest, light drab linsey underskirt, dark green alpaca petticoat, white chemise, brown ribbed stockings mended at feet with piece of white stocking, black straw bonnet trimmed with black beads and green and black velvet, large white handkerchief round neck, a pair of men's old lace boots and piece of coarse white apron. The Michaelmas daisy pattern is mentioned in the midst of a long and detailed official description in a report that was issued by the police to the press after the body had been taken to the mortuary at Golden Lane in the City of London. Very similar reports appeared in virtually every newspaper in the land. The report wasn't based on a quick glimpse by a reporter at the crime scene, nor while en route to the mortuary, nor based on an off-the-cuff remark made by a policeman. So the item of clothing with a Michaelmas daisy pattern was a dress and was not taken away by anyone, let alone by a stray Metropolitan policeman. It might be thought that these historical objections mean nothing if the DNA evidence proves that Catherine Eddowes' blood is on the shawl and other genetic material can be linked to Aaron Kosminski. The DNA evidence would surely trump all else. However, all of the scientists, including Jari, say the science depends on the shawl's provenance. The case for the DNA link is presaged on the provenance of the shawl, and as we have seen, that provenance is non-existent. But does the DNA evidence hold up to scrutiny? Eventually in 2019, Jari did publish a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. In it, there's no mention of 314.1c, nor for that matter 315.1c, or even TIAI. A big chunk of Jari's report deals with unquestioningly setting out the provenance of the shawl as if it's unimpeachable. The main supporting evidence produced by Jari was a letter that David Melville Hayes had written in 2007 when Russell Edwards bought the shawl from him, declaring the chain of ownership from Amos Simpson down. But then David Melville Hayes would say that, wouldn't he? Regarding the shawl, Jari said, "Due to the historic value of the shawl, it was decided early on that only non-invasive, minimally destructive methods would be applied." Given that a large central chunk had been cut out at some time in the past, 2 smaller pieces by an antiques dealer and another piece by the police at the Crime Museum, this sensitivity over the integrity of the shawl seems a bit late in the day. Interestingly, Jari also stated the initial aim of this report was not to actually solve the Jack the Ripper murders, but to evaluate how far the science can stretch to analyse over 100-year-old biological samples that are only available in minute amounts. To me, this sounds like he's saying, this paper is about my novel methodology for extracting and testing old degraded DNA. Don't focus too much on the Jack the Ripper side. If he thought this would legitimise his findings, then he was soon disabused. Walter Parson and Hansi Weisensteiner, remember those names, both criticised how the data was presented, saying that the mDNA sequences should be published, otherwise the reader cannot judge the result. Jari claimed that data protection legislation prevented him from publishing the mDNA sequences, but this was countered by Felice L. Bedford, PhD, that because mDNA is not individual specific, there could be no data protection implication. An individual's specific DNA sequence would not be exposed to the public. Furthermore, it's extremely commonplace to publish this sort of data with no legal consequences. The entire basis of how Jari presented his findings was questioned with this conclusion. Even mitochondrial DNA is innocent until proven guilty. Another critic, D. Kim Rosno, PhD, questioned one of Jari's claims that the mDNA extracted from some supposed semen, supposedly left by Kosminski, pointed towards someone with brown eyes and brown hair. It was pointed out that we don't actually know Kosminski's coloration. Moreover, the results of a phenotypic analysis are probabilistic, not definitive, so conclusions about hair colour cannot really be drawn. Also, the results of the mDNA analysis completely depend upon the strength of the connections between the shawl and the murder scene, the shawl and Eddowes, and the shawl and Kosminski. The probabilities for each of these links are so attenuated that the mDNA random match figure reported by Louhelainen and Miller is almost irrelevant. Remarkably, Jari responded that one of the reasons he had been vague in the presentation of his data was that people in the Ripper community might draw the wrong conclusions. In some cases, the available data have already been used to make incorrect conclusions, not even demonstrated in the paper. When these are escalated in private forums on the internet, The results can be very undesirable. Surely the answer to that is to provide more and conclusive information, not less. And how undesirable would it be if incorrect babble takes place on a private forum? This seems to be a very poor excuse for inhibiting the dissemination of scientific knowledge. But there was more. The paper we published was a case report, and the exact Halpo group would add very little of anything to it, but could actually raise even xenophobic issues. Releasing more information might raise xenophobic issues, presumably because Kosminski was Jewish, but everyone knows that Kosminski was Jewish. The entire book, which first published the DNA tests, made it very clear that Kosminski was Jewish. So how on earth could providing the relevant Halper groups raise xenophobic issues that had not already potentially been raised? That cat had long been out of the bag. History repeats itself. I'm reminded of the removal of the graffiti at Wentworth Model Dwellings, which was written inside the door jamb that now gives entry to Happy Days Fish and Chip Shop. It mentions Jewish, probably in reference to Jews. Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, in consultation with the local superintendent, Arnold, had the graffiti washed off before it could even be photographed, in case there was a public disturbance, with the local Jewish community being attacked. A potentially vital piece of evidence was destroyed in the process, but the wording of the graffiti soon spread everywhere and was reported in every newspaper, frustrating the intention behind its removal. And there were no public disturbances. So what was Jari's problem? After multiple concerns were raised, Michael Peet, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Forensic Sciences, in consultation with the publisher Wiley Periodicals, on behalf of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, investigated Jari's conclusions. Michael Peet attempted to obtain the original raw data. However, the authors stated that the data were no longer available due to instrument data failure and other complications. So Jari's data could not be checked. This is the scientific equivalent of the dog ate my homework. As a result, the editors of the Journal of Forensic Science appended the following to the paper. An expression of concern has been raised for this article. I will reiterate, the DNA evidence has been found to prove absolutely nothing. It cannot be verified. It's a big nothing burger. By the way, in the description below, I'll provide links to all the information I've discussed in this film if you want to check for yourselves. After this, everything went quiet, although Russell Edwards ran his own Jack the Ripper Facebook group with occasional tours, while persisting in vigorously claiming that he'd solved the case. But you can't keep a good man down. Many of you will remember the furore caused in 2022 when it was claimed that an amateur sleuth had discovered the remains of Keith Bennett, one of the victims of the Moors murderers Ian Bradley and Myra Hindley, who had been missing since he'd been abducted in 1964. Who was the amateur sleuth? Russell Edwards, of course. Russell Edwards convinced himself that Ian Brady had buried his victims in locations on Saddleworth Moor that mapped out some sort of Nazi symbol, and that this led him to Keith Bennett's supposed burial site. Russell Edwards claimed that he searched the area indicated by this Nazi symbol and found human remains. He then told the police, and the press of course. The police responded by conducting a detailed forensic search of the location that Russell Edwards indicated. Nothing was there. Greater Manchester Police reported no bones, fabric or items of interest were found. Another nothing burger. This of course caused tremendous distress to Keith Bennett's surviving family. This sorry episode is illustrative of how Russell Edwards jumps the gun in his over-enthusiasm to solve true crime mysteries. As with the Shawl, Russell Edwards refused to accept that he was wrong. This was the situation up until October 2024, when, as if from nowhere, the mainstream media regurgitated their extensive coverage of Russell Edwards' claim to have solved the Jack the Ripper case with DNA evidence. This seems to have been provoked by the pending publication of a new edition of his book naming Jack the Ripper. I went to the biggest Waterstones bookshop in London to try and have a look at this new edition, but they didn't stock it. I also checked online with Amazon. They didn't stock it. I couldn't find it anywhere online at all. It seems that this pre-publicity was a part of a stunt to drum up business in advance of Halloween for the Jack the Ripper tours that Russell Edwards now operates. But eventually I found a link saying that the book will be published in early December 2024, so expect another bout of publicity around then. I was wondering whether to hold off with this film until then, but I'll take a look at the new book when it comes out and confirm, probably in a short film, whether any new material is included. There seems to be only two new elements to this new edition. An AI image of Aaron Kosminski has been generated to show what they think he would have looked like. This AI image supposedly matches various eyewitness accounts of a man seen with one or other of the victims shortly before they were murdered. Also, there are vague claims that some of Aaron Kosminski's relatives were in a Jewish version of Freemasonry, which supposedly explains various possible Masonic links to the case. Once you invest in an item financially, it's all too easy and human to become invested in it emotionally. I think that's what happened with Russell Edwards. He is convinced that his Shawl has solved the Jack the Ripper case. It is certain that it has not. His DNA evidence proves nothing. As with the much earlier tests, the best that can be said that it is inconclusive, which we should not be surprised about. The provenance of the Shawl is non-existent. The chances of it being at Mitre Square are almost zero. It probably didn't even belong to Amos Simpson. There is a photograph of Amos Simpson in police uniform, complete with acting sergeant chevrons and a medal. This is probably the only genuine artefact relating to Amos Simpson. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe so you get notified by the next film, and to help the old YouTube algorithms, please like, share and comment below for a vigorous debate on the subject. Thank you very much.